The Fires of Ryloth =RK Part 6. Blue Squadron, en route to the Cis blockade on Ryloth. 250 Torrents raced toward the ungodly swarm of droid fighters milling around the Cis fleet. Below them, the capital ships were tearing at each other with bolts of energy more than powerful enough to vaporize any fighter deployed by either side. The scanners of Ahsoka's Delta 7 beeped, announcing that they had detected heavy proton torpedoes passing under the fighters. She glanced at the readout and smiled. "This is General Skywalker. Keep it steady, men. Be ready to execute Sucker Punch on my command." "General Skywalker comes with the most interesting names for the parts of this exercise," muttered Blue 2, known to his friends as Axe. "Nope. That wasn't Master's idea," chirped Ahsoka. "It was all General Vale's brainstorm." "That figures," mumbled Blue 4. "Who put that maniac in charge anyway?" "Do you have problem with our overall commander, Sev?" asked Blue 5. "Just with our tiny part of his plan," quipped Blue 4. "It requires us to piss off 10,000 or so vultures. Nah. What possible issue could I have with such orders?" he deadpanned. "Look it from the bright side, Sev. The general expects at least some of us to survive. After all, we need to be in one piece in order to goad the droids to follow us," said Axe. "It may even work," whispered Blue 3. =RK=. While the fighters were closing in on their targets, the first salvo of Republic heavy torpedoes hit. 7 proton warheads made it through the last-ditch defensive fire and the thick fighter screen. They were concentrated on only 2 ships, both of which were bathed in white-hot plasma. 1 frigate was struck by 4 torpedoes. The first 3 smashed into her armored nose milliseconds from each other, annihilating the forward third of the ship. The last one struck the junction where the bridge pylon and the main hull of the craft met. It buried itself in the armored hull before detonating. The resulting explosion sent a shockwave which shattered the whole bridge section and rent a massive crater in the remaining part of the ship. Series of internal explosions tore what was left of the ship apart. The second Munificent was marginally luckier. The torpedoes hit her port side, with one colliding with the fin sticking from her nose. It blew up, vaporizing the offensive protuberance. The short-ranged blast wave stripped armor plates off the forward section, opening multiple compartments to space. Scores of unfortunate droids were either outright destroyed or sucked out to space. The 2 remaining torpedoes blew up over the heavy sloped armor covering the upper half of the frigate. While the blossoming detonations opened huge craters in the side of the ship, they were spread far away from each other, enough to allow the Confederation craft to retain some semblance of structural integrity. She listed to her port side and fell out of formation while her droid complement fought to contain the fires and power surges threatening to go out of control. A few minutes later, she was put out of her misery by a barrage of turbo laser fire from the Requiem, which got her sights on the frigate while traversing her guns to aim at her next chosen target. =RK=. Light Cruiser Stalker, Arquitens class. Commander VLK 531 calmly surveyed the bridge of his ship, where his brethren were efficiently doing their jobs. He was newly promoted as a commanding officer of the light cruiser, which for all intents and purposes was a scaled-down model of the Venator class. However, he didn't care about that. Volk, as he was more commonly known, was proud of both his ship and crew. "We are in missile range," said the weapons office. "Very well." The commander looked at one of the data feeds from the flagship. 8 seconds later it blinked green, showing that all Arquitens were in range. That was his K. "Flush all tubes. Maximum rate of fire," ordered Volk. It was time to see if the first phase of General Vale's plan was going to work. A light tremor passed through the deck as the 4 missile launchers released their deadly contents at the clankers. They were a part of a staggered salvo sent by all of Stalker's sister ships. =RK=. Blue Squadron, near the Cis blockade, Ryloth. Execute Sucker Punch, barked Skywalker. "You heard him, boys. Go," ordered Ahsoka. 250 V-19 Torrents sent a pair of missiles each at the armada of enemy fighters, which were just outside of effective energy weapons range. Yet that didn't stop the machines from opening fire. In the next instant, the Republic starfighters broke off their headlong charge at the enemy, and separated into 2 groups, which looped above and below their previous vector. Only 217 of them lived long enough to do so. 421 droid fighters became prey to the missile strike, one moment living and ready for battle and in the next becoming so much short-lived stars. More than 1,000 vultures separated from the swarm and flew in pursuit of the offending enemy torrents. To their machine intelligence, the outcome was predetermined. Their enemies had made a mistake. By trying to loop back to their lines, the Republic craft had placed themselves in a vulnerable position, where the vultures could easily out-accelerate and catch them from the rear. Or so they believed. RO was sent over the droid network by one of the vultures leading the pursuit. Its sensors revealed the truth and it sent the data to its brethren in the last moments of its existence. Not that it was going to do them any good. The 92 light missiles from the first light cruiser salvo had changed their direction and flew in the teeth of the pursuing vultures. They were followed by the third and fourth spread of heavy torpedoes launched by the Vinotas, all of which were rigged with proximity fuses. Usually using such weapons against fighters would be a waste. Blast waves didn't propagate well in space. A warhead that could wipe out anything in the air for dozens of kilometers in atmosphere was virtually useless in space beyond a few hundred meters, a kilometer at best. That, however, didn't take into account the spread usually maintained between fighters. With the swarm choking the space around the CIS capital ships, while flying in such vectors as to be clear from the barrages exchanged by the heavy combatants, the tactical picture was different. The vultures were vulnerable to proximity kills. The ordered formations pursuing the fleeing fighters which had executed mirror image, flew apart as the droids tried to evade the blast zones of the oncoming missiles. It was too little too late. For brief seconds, more than 100 suns were born, lived and died amongst the vulture formations. When the glare of the proton explosions subdued, the tattered remains of the pursuing fighters could be seen. 81 battered droid fighters remained combat effective from 1,000 strong. "Great work, men," exclaimed Anakin. The odds were just evened a bit more. Unfortunately, he doubted that they would be able to do that 10 more times. The vulture swarm was already diffusing, so it wouldn't represent such an easy target again. That actually worked. Blue 5 wondered aloud. Arche equals. Luxury Hulk Command Ship Procurer, CIS blockade. This was creative, muttered Captain Took. Nearly a tenth of his fighter strength was wiped out by that trap, but he already gave orders which would avoid a repeat performance. At the same time, 3 more of his frigates died, but they took another enemy dreadnought and couple of those missile-armed light cruisers with them. While the exchange was nominally in the enemy's favor, that was only because the Republic capital ships were much tougher than his frigates. A state of affairs that won't last long when the enemy's shields failed. He looked at the plot. Sure enough, one of the Venator was losing its shields. The drop of the ship's energy emissions was an obvious tell. The 8 frigates pounding that cruiser would soon have her gone. Took checked the distance between the 2 fleets. They were still at long range from his ships. When the enemy closed to medium range, he would play one of his thump cards. He watched as the Republic fighters which played bait for the trap reformed, receiving a couple of wings as reinforcements and flew to execute another stinging attack. The CIS captain lamented the fact that he had no missile-armed interceptors in his fleet. He knew that they were on the drawing boards, but it would be few months at least before the Vulture modification which would be able to carry 4 missiles could be produced in numbers. At least the specs of the Confed fighter missiles made the ones used by the Republic look like pieces of obsolete junk in comparison. Not that it helped his situation, when he lacked any of those wonder weapons. The enemy crawled closer, while another 2 munificent died in exchange for an enemy light cruiser. Then, 2 important things happened in quick succession. First, the shields of one of the Vinotas failed and the cruiser was promptly turned into a drifting burning hulk by the heavy guns of 7 frigates. Second, the enemy fleet passed into medium range. "The time is right. Call in the reserves. Send them here and here," ordered Mook, giving the relevant coordinates to his subordinate droids. "Roger, Roger," answered a command B1, which had its head painted yellow. "The moment our reserve attacks, send 2/3 of our fighters at the heart of the Republic fleet." Now all Mark could do was wait for the Republic's commander answer, as well as for the right time to play his next card. RK equals. Republic Cruiser Requiem, Task Force Retribution Flagship. More than 100 wings of vultures were already gone. That was just a drop in the bucket. There were too damn many of the buggers remaining. There were cheers on the bridge as the 9th enemy frigate was consumed by fire, but they were soon subdued as another Aquitans cruiser was shattered. That ship went afoul of the heavy guns of an enemy battleship which promptly swatted it out of the way. However, that wasn't the only reason the bridge crew grew quiet. The Defender, one of Requiem's sister ships' space frame cracked after a series of massive explosions engulfed her. I don't know how many times she was struck after her shields failed, but the final salvos that hit her were just too much. She started blowing apart when more than a dozen heavy turbo laser shots hit deep into her structure. The armor that was supposed to protect her was long gone by that point. The Defender was torn asunder into 11 big pieces, which bled men and air into the unforgiving frozen abyss of space. Of the 7,400 sailors crewing her, it would be a miracle if only few hundred were still alive. While the men and women under my command fought and died for the Republic, I stood impassive, showing only a calm, professional exterior. I didn't show that I felt the death of my people or how much I loathed it. The only gift I could give them was to spend their lives as wisely as I could in the cauldron of war. I felt a shift in the force, moment before 4 munificents slid out from hyperspace on each flank of my fleet. They were covered with the predatory forms of hundreds of vultures, which wasted no time and flew away from their motherships. It was time. The smart thing to do for the CIS commander would be to send most of his vultures to smash through our fighter screen and hit the fleet, while we were preoccupied with the enemy reserve. That would give me a brief moment of opportunity. Call in an escort carrier at each flank. I want them to hit those frigates from behind, I calmly ordered. Internally I fumed. If only I had a couple of months to train my ragtag fleet, I would have made this a battle of maneuver, but as it was, I had under my command a force made from parts of multiple different fleets. It was a small miracle that my ships were able to follow my orders to the letter so far. The only ships I could trust for intricate maneuvers were those that were already part of my fleet, as well as the two now, Venottas under Skywalker's command. However, most of those were Venottas, and I needed their firepower with the main fleet. My reserve on the other hand consisted by my hand-picked officers, commanding my 2 assault carriers as well as the 3 converted freighters. Their actions were going to make or break this battle. The enemy frigates flanking us opened fire the moment they exited hyperspace. They smashed through the light picket of CR-90s, blowing up 6 of the corvettes, which stood no chance under the concentrated fire of the heavier ships. However, their brave sacrifice bought time for the 2 escort carriers I called to jump in behind the munificents and start launching their deadly brood. To make the counterattack even sweeter, every one of the carriers was equipped with one-shot racks of proton torpedoes. While those were light, the same carried by bombers, the PLC-27s had box launchers holding 200 each. Each had only 2 of them, because the logistics corps were not able to provide more torpedoes before Operation Retribution was launched. Not without striping weapons from the Coruscant Defense Fleet, which was out of the question after the attack. Despite the strong image we were showing to the media, the Republic's situation was bad, and it would be months, perhaps a year, before the economy could be fully geared to a war footing, and most equipment shortages could be met. The escort carriers targeted 2 frigates each and unloaded their torpedoes at the munificents' rears. A wave of proton death struck the engines of the Separatists' ships and spread from there up their hull. Flowers of blue-colored plasma blossomed where the torpedoes impacted. The drive pods of the frigates couldn't handle the energies battering them and blew up almost in unison, sending their ships tumbling through space. 2 of the frigates suffered catastrophic damage. Their reactors couldn't scram in time. The resulting detonations turned those craft into so much shrapnel, which decimated most of their fighter complements. With their work done, weapons expended and 400 fighters in total launched, the 2 escort carriers jumped into hyperspace. That left the fresh torrents to brave the fire of the remaining enemy frigates while racing in a tail chase to catch the nearly twice their number of vultures. Said killing machines were plunging headlong at the Republic fleet, heedless of losses or their pursuers. I saw all of that on one of the holographic displays showing the space near my main forces. However, most of my attention was at the enemy units near Iloth. I smiled coldly when a wall of about 7,000 odd droid fighters raced towards my fleet. Call in the rest of the reserve. Hammer blow is a go, I said with a calmness I didn't feel. Shift to fire plan beta, and inform Admiral Yularen that he has tactical command of the fleet. I'm heading out. Yes, sir. Confirmed Palion. I could see the question in the Commodore's eyes. Right now I can do more outside, strapped in my fighter's cockpit. I have no more tricks to play, Gilad. May the force be with you, I said and headed for the armored doors at the back of the bridge. And with you, General. Good luck, said Palion. RK equals. Luckry Hulk Command Ship Procura, blockade over Ryloth. Captain Mook was watching the holographic representation of the battle with a frown. 4 of the reserve frigates were already gone, blown up by those damn retrofits. Yet, it meant little. Most of their fighters were out and heading at the heart of the enemy fleet. Even better, most of the anti-fighter escorts the Republic had, were concentrated to the front. That would be painful for the main wave fighters he had sent to strike at the enemy, but Ma had more than enough assets so he could afford the losses. New contacts. Critical proximity, exclaimed one of the droids manning the sensor stations. Took snarled when the relevant information was displayed into his data goggles. So this is where the rest of the enemy reserve went. The last of the so-called escort carriers were above his fleet with the 2 acclimator assault carriers at the flanks. They were already launching their fighters and bombers. What should we do? Asked one of the droids. Sent the rest of the vultures at these ships. That's why I kept them back, the captain smiled viciously. He had nearly 3,000 more fighters left. They would swat out of the sky those arrogant fools. All that time, he didn't stop to think where the Republic's bombers were, believing them to be in the safety of the Venator's hangars. RK equals. Republic assault carrier victorious, cis blockade of Ryloth right flank. This was a suicide mission. Everyone on board knew it, but none more keenly than Captain KLR-71, known as Clark. The attack of the 3 carriers was a diversion. He knew it and what it meant for him and his crew. Yet, strangely enough, the clone officer was all right with it. If it worked, it would mean that thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of his brothers would live to fight another day. I want those sensor sweeps done yesterday. He barked at the man operating the sensor console. The 3 Republic carriers managed to launch their fighter complements before something bigger than light guns could target them, but that was of no consequence. It appeared that the CIS commander was declining to take off the pressure from the main fleet. It was the right decision. The 3 ships from Task Force Anvil were doomed anyway. Each of them had about 1,000 vultures converging on their positions with only a fraction of those numbers in Torrance to meet that onslaught. It would be a slaughter, just as General Vale had planned. But while the damn clankers were too busy killing them, their fighters were not available to protect the capital ships. It's done. We have the coordinates, shouted the sensor operator. Excellent. Transmit them to Hammer. Clark ordered. It took 10 seconds, in which the bulk of the vultures were coming closer and closer, while the 120 torrents of the victorious fighter complement were dueling with 3 times their number of enemy starfighters, which were closer to the carriers than the rest. Before she was swarmed, the assault carrier under Clark's command managed to finish off a munificent which had her shields down. While the Victorious was being torn apart by waves of vultures, the units of Task Force Hammer jumped out from hyperspace to the coordinates provided by the 3 Republic ships which were sacrificing themselves to create that priceless opening. Equals. Republic Cruiser Requiem, Task Force Retribution. Commodore Palion glared at the vulture droids which were attacking his ship. They were coming in, guns blazing, and slamming in his precious Requiem at full acceleration. Gilad's eyes narrowed at the enemy fighter which was flying straight at him. The last-ditch defensive fire missed the vulture and it slammed straight through the windows of the port command tower of the Venator. At the same time, 520 Y-wing bombers jumped in point-blank range of the CIS fleet under the command of Captain Martuk. It was possible only thanks to the data sent by the 3 carriers. The bombers jumped on such vectors so that there were no enemy fighters between them and their prey. Order of battle for the CIS fleet blockading Ryloth. Luckry Hulk Command Ship Procura, 1,500 droid fighters. Luckry Hulk battleships, 3, 1,500 droid fighters each. Luckry Hulk freighters, lightly armed, 6, 300 droid fighters each. Munificent frigates. Main fleet, 32, 100 droid fighters each. Reserve fleet, 8, 150 droid fighters each. Vulture fighter complement, 12,200. Storm of Blood and Steel. RK. Part 1. Task Force Hammer, CIS blockade over Ryloth. All Y-wing bombers dedicated to Operation Retribution exited hyperspace at point-blank range of the Confederation fleet. Even better, they returned to normal space on vectors not only clear of enemy fighters, but more than far enough from the nearest vultures, so they could execute their first attack run without opposition. Each of the still combat-worthy munificents in the main body of the blockading fleet, all 22 of them, were pounced on by 24 bombers. Some of the frigates' close-in weapons opened fire, but it was too little, too late. Only 6 Y-wings were unlucky enough to be swatted away by the final defensive fire of their prey, before the rest of the bombers were flying over their targets, unleashing every last weapon they carried. The bombers moved in waves of 6, leaving one lucky CIS ship to be hit by only 16 Republic small craft. The weapons of the first Y-wing group would shatter armor and scorch weapon emplacements, leaving easy-to-exploit gaps in the defenses of their chosen target. The second and third left the frigates as little more than drifting wrecks, which were engulfed in fire. In most cases the firepower of the last 6 bombers was almost wasted as they delivered coup de grace to the stricken munificents. 1 minute. That is how long it took for the unopposed bombers to turn once proud ships in so much flotsam. So far the total price for that coup were 39 Y-wings and their pilots. It was about to rise. == Republic Cruiser Requiem, Task Force Retribution. Commander Padawan stared at the distinctive form of a vulture droid, which was becoming bigger by the moment. Then it hit the starboard command tower. The live feed of the camera cut off, leaving the monitor shaped like a window go black for a second, before it started showing the images caught by another camera, which promptly was cut off too as a whole squadron smashed through the other bridge tower of the Requiem. Gilad shook his head. He, and the men working around him should be dead right now. They would be, if it was not for the general's insistence, that they ran the ship from the newly installed CIC, which was deep within the Venator's superstructure. It took almost a month for the engineers to make what used to be one of the damage control stations and its attached storage rooms in a single, reinforced compartment, not to mention making sure that the cruiser could actually be ran from there. He took a deep breath. It was worth it. So much for the damned tradition that had directed ship construction for countless millennia. Padawan frowned at the monitors which were showing camera feeds from the outside. He believed that General Vale wanted to make a point when he ordered the engineers to shape said monitors and the walls on which they were placed into an exact replicas of the bridge's windows. It worked too. Everyone in the CIC was now aware what would have happened if they were up in the standard bridge. Seeing the damn fighters closing in on the windows would leave a lasting impression to every one of them. The single thing Gilad regretted was that the Requiem was so far the only warship with such modification. Prior to the Coruscant attacks, most of the brass had been adamant that there would be no need for such an expensive refit, which left the rest of the fleet vulnerable. Unfortunately, after the attacks, there wasn't sufficient personnel to do such modifications in the time required. Trying to do so would take a ship out of commission for a month on average, something they could not afford. On a brighter note, creating a dedicated CIC from which the Republic ships would be commanded, was something that would be required from all new construction. Such modifications were already being made on ships in dock, which would be there for a month or more. All that was a cold comfort for the men and women who were about to die today. As things stood, no other Venator or Acclamator could be effectively run from anywhere but the bridge. That was one tradition that was going to bite the Republic Navy in the ass. Target that munificent, snapped Padawan, pointing the closest enemy frigate which was flanking the fleet. Half of the Requiem's heavy turrets rotated and unleashed hell upon the charging Confed ship. Few seconds later, he received confirmation that Hammer had jumped in. That should pull out the teeth of the enemy capital ships. There was only one small problem remaining. That criffing wall of vultures which were about to hit the tiny in comparison fighter force under the command of Skywalker. At least the CESP was moping out what was left, read not already rammed into Republic cruisers, of the Separatists' reserve fighter force. == Republic escort carrier Remember Coruscant, CIS blockade over Ryloth. The hull of the former transport ship was struck by a wave of suicidal droid fighters. They blew up large chunks of the hastily laid armor, which had been placed over her thin skin. That particularly exercise had just finished couple of days ago. It was a testament to the skill of the engineers who made it possible, that the refit was still relatively whole, despite the punishment she was absorbing. "Keep her steady for few more seconds," shouted Captain Jolie Solo. His first mate, the Wookiee Trao, roared affirmative. The large being's dark, almost black fur shook in unison with their ship, as the old girl took it after hit. Trao was an old friend of Jolie, who had also volunteered when he figured out what Solo was about to do. The Wookiee mentioned something about Jolie needing an adult's supervision. Captain Solo and the rest of his crew were all volunteers. He had been more than eager to offer his ship, when a week ago the Republic Navy had put out the call for container transports. They even offered to buy her at a price that exceeded the market one, but he had declined that extra payment in exchange of being allowed to retain command. Few hours later he had been contacted by General Vale himself, who was alternatively being declared as the hero of the day or the infamous man who let most of the Senate get killed. Solo wasn't interested in any of that. What did he care about a bunch of corrupt politicians, when he had buried his little sister and 2 nephews just days earlier? They were his closest relatives, and were waiting for his arrival at the spaceport near the Senate building when it was attacked by the Criffing separatists. The biggest piece they found of his family members was an arm. He had to bury them in sealed caskets which were mostly empty. So he spoke with the general, and they reached an agreement. Solo enlisted in the Republic Navy and waited for a chance to get the vengeance he craved. Skip forward about a week or so, and here he was, commanding his old girl. She had been refitted as escort carrier and given teeth. Now he was a part of an all-volunteer crew, participating in what for all intents and purposes was a suicide mission. It was irrelevant. He would take another piece of the separatist scum, even if it was the last thing he'll ever do. By all 9 hells of his beloved Corellia, he had already hurt the bastards more than he had prayed to achieve. The bombers were already jumping in, ready to savage the clankers. But it was not enough. The fighters his ship had deployed were fighting for their lives and would buy him few more precious moments. Remember, Coruscant still had her light torpedoes. She was darting at full speed at the back of an enemy battleship which itself was a converted Lucree Hulk freighter. Its heavy guns were already traversing and tracking the much lighter ship. Solo smirked viciously. Only few of them would be able to shoot at his girl before it was too late. "We are in range," shouted his weapons officer. "Fire," spat Solo. The converted container ship screamed as heavy turbo lasers cut through her lighter shields and impaled her hull. The rear section of the ship was reduced to rubble, but it wasn't enough to stop her. Captain Solo's head met the deck, before everything went black. The escort carrier spat 175 torpedoes. One of the box launchers was gone thanks to a vulture which kamikazed the ship, and continued on her previous trajectory. Remember, Coruscant was aimed straight at the main junction between the sphere and the rest of the Lucree Hulk battleship. Light guns started eating through her shields, but only 3 heavy turbo laser clusters could bear on the ship. However, those were able to shoot only twice before they, and most weapon emplacements on the upper half of the heavy capital ship were annihilated by a wave of torpedoes. What criffing piece of junk hit me? Moaned Captain Solo. He felt almost as bad as that time few years ago, when he ended drinking a whole bottle of aged Corellian brandy. "Ruaout," someone roared. "Told me so?" "About what?" Solo grumbled. He opened his eyes, which was even more painful for his abused head, and blinked owlishly at Trao. The Wookiee was pointing his huge paw towards the window of the escape pod. Outside, the shattered remains of Remember Coruscant slammed into the scorched Leviathan that had destroyed the escort carrier. After the massive torpedo strike, this was one abuse too many. The huge battleship was torn in 2 huge pieces, which tumbled through space. The sphere where the reactor was still working was relatively intact, but its few still operational weapons were useless while she was floating aimlessly through the ether. Far behind it, the main hull of the Lucree Hulk was a flaming wreck, which, while still had about a third of its heavy weapons intact, hadn't enough power to use them. "Look at that criffing son of a bitch go!" cheered Solo. He was smiling for the first time since his sister and nephews were murdered. Trao answered Jolie with a triumphant roar which nearly deafened him. Assault carrier victorious, cis blockade over Ryloth. All hands, abandon ship," coughed Clark. The bridge of the modified acclamator was turned into pandemonium. 3 vultures had struck the command tower near simultaneously, wrecking most of it. By some miracle, the bridge itself was still airtight, but the shock waves had caused the power system to overload, blowing up relays and couple of consoles which were struck by power surges. 3 of his brothers were dead as a result. Damn the criffing lowest bidder. This was the real world and not some stupid holodrama. Such things were not supposed to happen. "Watch out," shouted the navigation officer. Clark turned his head towards the windows behind him. He died with a curse on his lips, when a droid fighter smashed through the bridge before exploding. Clark's last thought was to thank the stars that his ship had only skeleton crew. On the other side of the blockade, the crippled leveler had done her job and tried to evade the heavy guns of the closest battleship. A relentless barrage wrecked her starboard side, sending the assault carrier into uncontrolled spin. She would end her doomed flight in the upper atmosphere of Ryloth, where she would be torn asunder during the re-entry. Pieces of the leveler would rain all over the northern hemisphere of the planet. =RK= Republic Cruiser Relentless, Task Force Retribution Flagship. Admiral Yularen cursed whoever first introduced the exposed bridges used by everyone's warship designers. 2 Venotas, Conviction and Coruscant's Pride, were drifting out of control. The third cruiser, which was similarly stuck, Requiem, continued to fight as if nothing had happened, despite having both its command towers sheared off by repeated vulture strikes. When this battle was over, he would insist that all ships under his command were outfitted with dedicated CICs. If he lived that long. The admiral stared at the plot. Of the enemy's reserve, only 1 frigate, which was being blasted to pieces, remained, as well as 20-odd fighters, which were being hunted down by the CISP. However, the price has been heavy. 121 torrents were lost and all cruiser in the fleet were damaged. Thankfully most had only few weapon emplacements missing. But if that was the damage dealt by 900-odd vultures, then what horror could be wrought by almost 8 times that number? The wall of droid fighters would strike the bulk of torrents commanded by Skywalker in seconds. The Jedi General wouldn't be able to stop them. They were just too many of those things. The vultures were coming in for a suicide run, accelerating all the way. The damage each of them would cause would make the previous attack pale in comparison. "I want that frigate silenced, then shut down the heavy weapons and divert the power to shields and anti-fighter guns. Then brace for impact," ordered Yularen. =RK= General Skywalker's Delta 7 interceptor. Anakin let the Force flow through him, preparing himself for the coming onslaught. This was going to be ugly. Outnumbered 7-1, Skywalker knew that he wouldn't be able to stop even a third of the coming vultures. He had only 917 fighters, with the rest of the torrents flying as a CISP for the fleet at his back. He prayed that the escorts and Vale's last surprise would be enough, if not all capital ships were going to be shattered. He took a deep breath. "Here they come. Open fire," ordered Skywalker. He sent 2 missiles at the swarm of dark metal which seemed to fly straight at him and opened fire with his laser cannons. His fighter force, which was nothing to sneeze at, no matter how outnumbered they were, followed his lead. "May the Force be with you, Master," he heard Ahsoka's voice before her squadron entered the fray. "And with you, Snips. Stay safe," he whispered. Then there was no time for anything but fighting for his life. Storm of Blood and Steel. =RK= Part 2. Task Force Hammer, CIS blockade of Ryloth. As per their orders, the Republic bombers finished their attack run and headed towards the command ship. That would be their last target, and after it was silenced, they would retreat to hyperspace. The V-19s launched from the 3 carriers that were attacking the blockading fleet were doing their best to tie up the vultures, so that the bombers could execute one last attack before the thousands of enemy fighters could cut them to pieces. It worked. Mostly. The Y-wings, which had targeted frigates close to the CIS heavy hitters, barely managed to reach the command ship before a wave of droid fighters jumped them. The clone pilots and their gunners braved the fire and death spat from the vengeful vultures and defensive weaponry of the battleships. From the 209 bombers, 175 lived long enough to hit the command ship. They unloaded their remaining torpedoes at the huge craft and overflew its superstructure with guns blazing. 103 Y-wings survived to try escaping to hyperspace. The Republic bombers, which originally attacked frigates further away from the battleships, fought valiantly but were unable to reach the battle wagons. Nearly 2,000 vultures swarmed them. The only silver lining was that by diverting those droid fighters, some of the surviving torrents were allowed to flee. 520 Y-wings as well as 440 V-19 attacked the CIS battle line, decimating it. They also took with them 959 vultures. 41 bombers and 67 fighters survived long enough to retreat. =RK Luckry Hulk Command Ship Procurer, CIS blockade over Ryloth. Captain Martuk glared balefully at the information fed into his data goggles. He criffed up. He'd made one bad call. One flawed assumption, and it was going to cost him his fleet. Oh, he would keep the Republic from achieving their objective, but that was no comfort for him. It might save his carrier, but he'll be lucky to ride a desk until the end of the war. He ordered 2/3 of his escorting fighters towards those damn bombers, but he knew it would be largely futile. This was a damn trap and he had fallen into it. It was his criffing fault for assuming that those Y-wings were still on board of their motherships. He knew that the Republic's small craft had hyperdrives, damn it. But to execute such a precise tactical jump, it was risky, criffing suicidal even. Or would have been. He shook his head in a grudging admiration. It all made sense. Those 3 escort carriers were not sacrificed in vain. They would soon die, but the damage was already done. They had scanned his fleet and the space surrounding it, and sent jump coordinates to the bombers. Now it was time for the hammer to fall. In quick succession, 2 frigates went off the grid. Now it was all over but the moping up. The bombers would soon be done for and he'll watch how his vultures tear apart the Republic fleet. "Sir, the bombers are coming our way," exclaimed one of the droids. "They won't make it," stuttered the captain, before he saw one of the battleships flanking his command ship, being torn in two when a Republic carrier rammed it. Were those people insane? Ma frantically started struggling with the security harness on his chair. He had to strap himself in before it was too late. The behemoth that was the Procurer shuddered as wave after wave of Y-wings tore into the battleship's hull. She lurched to the port as her armor was breached, and whole wings of bombers unleashed hell into the chink in her defenses. The light and data feeds abruptly cut off, causing the captain to bathe in cold sweat. This was the longest minute in his life. When the onslaught ended, Tuke was left in a drifting wreck, which had no communication with the outside world. Only the emergency power was on, bathing the bridge in sinister red light. Ma looked around, and saw that the B-1 droid crew was largely intact and milling around their dark consoles. "Orders, Captain?" asked the yellow-painted droid commander. "All organic personnel are to abandon ship," snapped Tuke, while trying to get out of his harness. He no longer felt confident in the outcome. He thought for a moment how long it would take him to reach an intact escape pod. "Give that order in 60 seconds. He growled at the poor droid. Tuke had to get off the crippled ship before the Republic battle line managed to finish it off. == Blue Squadron, near Task Force Retribution. Ahsoka sent her interceptor into a spin, desperately trying to evade the fire of dozens, perhaps hundreds, enemy fighters. Her gloved thumb was clamped on the trigger for her Delta 7's cannons, which were sending a stream of blue death at the droids trying to kill her and her men. Her blaster fire blew up a droid fighter, then a second and a third in quick succession. Yet for every one she downed, 2 more were taking its place. Behind Ahsoka, her squadron was flying in close formation, sending missiles and laser bolts at the offending vultures. It was a scene repeating itself dozens of times, all along the front of the oncoming swarm. The Torrents took first blood by salvoing close to 2,000 missiles at the armada of enemy machines. Significant parts were shot down by a wall of crimson fire, others homed in on the same fighter. Many detonated prematurely when striking fragments of already destroyed vultures. Despite all that, the clone pilots reaped an impressive harvest. 1,133 enemy fighters lit up the eternal night of space with their funeral pyres. That was the easy part, something everyone knew. After the first missile volley, the vultures were upon them. The skirmish was short and brutal. 15 seconds. That's all it took for the droid formation to pass through the Republic fighters trying to stop them. Men of flesh and blood met with beings of cold logic, electronics and steel, in a whirlwind of fire and death. After becoming an ace once today, Ahsoka blew up her 6th vulture for the battle, starting a second tally. She aimed at the 7th and pressed the trigger, before banking up in a futile attempt to evade the enemy. The Force was screaming warnings, and she could feel where the danger laid. The Padawan trusted her instincts, weaving her interceptor between lines of scarlet laser fire, yet it was not enough. In a perfect moment of clarity, Ahsoka knew that the Jedi's foresight could be as much curse as a blessing. She could see in her mind where the droid's blaster fire would go. Her reflexes were better than even those of the machines she was facing. Her squadron tried to protect her. They flew at the enemies attacking their leader and managed to buy her a few more seconds. One after another, the members of Blue Squadron perished, turned to space dust as their fighters became funeral pyres. First to go was Sev, after smashing 2 more vultures. His brothers followed suit in the span of moments until only Axe remained. He launched his last 2 missiles, then proceeded to blast another droid fighter with his cannons. With his last breath, he took out one final enemy. When his V-19 annihilated both itself and the vulture it struck headlong. She felt them all die in the Force. Even the 2 who were fast enough to eject in time, were extinguished a moment later. Their loss hit her hard, causing her to feel almost physical pain. It broke her concentration for a moment. Her deep connection with the Force wavered and she missed the last opportunity to evade the incoming enemy fire. After that, her supernatural reflexes were irrelevant. Her Delta 7 simply wasn't agile enough to evade all the fire directed at her. Despite all that, the sacrifice of her squadron meant everything. She found herself into an impossible situation for only few seconds, before the Cis fighters moved away. In that brief slice of time, Ahsoka became the target of 100 or so machines. The right wing of her fighter shattered as if it was made of glass. Its nose was speared by a long line of laser bolts, which blew huge chunks of armor and delicate machinery away. It was a small miracle that the fighter didn't explode up there and then. In a desperate bid for survival, Ahsoka used the Force to eject. She knew that her hands wouldn't be fast enough. She was slammed back into her pilot seat as it was blown away from her dying ride. She channeled all desperation in fueling her telekinetic strength to guide the chair she was strapped to around a hail of laser bolts. Then she pushed herself away from being splattered all over the space frame of a vulture which flew past her face. Below her, the mortally wounded Delta 7 exploded, followed by a nearby droid fighter. She was touched by the edge of the blast wave, but mercifully enough, no shrapnel punctured her suit. Before losing consciousness, she thanked the Force and Delcatar for the sealed suit he had insisted she wear during the battle. Anakin cursed when he felt Ahsoka's presence dimming. She was knocked out and hurt, however he could do nothing to help her right now. He had to suppress an un-Jedi-like rush of fury, which threatened to engulf him. He knew that losing it here and now was likely to get him killed. Skywalker snarled and blew another enemy fighter which had the unfortunate luck of passing in front of his interceptor. Those criffing machines had hurt his apprentice. His friend. He remembered what happened in the Senate. Instead of continuing his attempt to suppress his fury, he let it flow through him, fueling the Force, which he used to further enhance his reflexes. He pulled off such a sharp turn that the frame of his Delta 7 groaned in protest, but he ignored it and lined up in his sights a squadron of droid fighters. His laser cannons tore through the offending machines, and he felt a fierce satisfaction of his small victory. When the short explosion of the last one cleared away, Anakin searched for another target but found none. The vultures were speeding away, continuing their self-destructive charge at the fleet. He scowled at the machines and raced after them, followed by the remaining Republic fighters. The short skirmish saw the destruction of 686 Torrents and 2,547 vultures. Anakin wasn't aware of those numbers, but that was irrelevant. There were too many of the criffing machines remaining, and all his channeled anger wouldn't make his fighter go fast enough. =RK= General Vale's Custom Delta 7B, Task Force Retribution. By the time I'd made my way to the hangar and launched, most of the vultures attacking the fleet had either rammed or were blasted to pieces. That didn't stop me from claiming a few kills. I pounced on a squadron of the droid fighters, which were making beelines to the remains of the Requiem's command towers. I smiled under my helmet at the way my interceptor was handling, when I executed a sharp turn and found myself at the tail of the enemy formation. Few short bursts later and the vultures were turned into a bunch of disintegrating wrecks. Most of them blew up, raining cooling debris at the cruiser, with only one remaining sufficiently intact to slam in the heavy upper armor. Its only effect was to leave a small dent. The fighters of this era were nice pieces of equipment. I especially liked my new custom ride, however that didn't stop them feel somewhat lackluster. Here I was, 4,000 years in the future, and the standard small craft of both sides didn't even have shields. To be honest, I expected so much more. The fact that I could just jump in any given bird of this era and fly without any additional training was telling. Where was the progress? The amazing new equipment one would expect? I helped the CSP to mop up the remaining vultures and had them reform between the capital ships and the escorts. While we were dealing with the enemy reserves and reforming after that, the main attack had passed through the fighter screen commanded by Skywalker and was heading our way. Hope that my preparations were sufficient and wait to play my last card. I had kept the escort ships which should have been deployed with my own reserve back. 6 additional Karak light cruisers and 10 CR-90 corvettes waited my signal to join the defense line. It won't be long now. The swarm of enemy fighters was just entering into range of my other surprise. It all began few months ago, when the 3 acclimators under my command were being refitted into anti-fighter role. I disagreed with the Navy engineers. They believed that gutting half the heavy cannons of the assault ships and replacing them with light laser guns would be enough. I begged to differ with such a statement. My problem was that even if all other weaponry was replaced with flat guns, it still wouldn't be enough. Not for dealing with the swarms I believed the enemy could deploy if pressed. Besides, such a radical refit would need a major redesign of the cruiser's power distribution network, which would place them in dock for a lot longer than I could afford. That led me to visit the R&D department of the Navy, where I checked some of the concept for dealing with enemy fighters, which were not approved by the brass for one reason or another. One of the concepts I came through with was something that would be familiar to the wet navies of my Earth, which was few dimensions away. It was to stuff acclimators or Venottas with racks of VLC tubes, advanced sensors, and shoot a lot of missiles at the enemy. It would turn the ships in something akin to an Aegis cruiser's big brother. While the heart of the system, the fire control computers and those processing all the data needed to defeat the enemy ECM were deep within the hull of the cruiser, the additional sensor arrays and the box missile launchers were bolted on the hull. The downside was that the additional sensors and the anti-fighter missiles were relatively expensive. Just one missile cost as much as the combat load of a V-19. Combine that with the fact that so far the CIS were not deploying even close to the maximum fighter strength their ships could carry. I blamed that on Palpy's meddling, and it made clear why the system was not deployed. Damn, there were a few prototypes but no one seemed interested at mounting them on ships. That changed when the refit of the Dauntless, Honor and Warspite began. It took a lot of bargaining to have the system, which was called Guardian, installed and supplied with missiles. I had to give credit to the creators of the system, though a success would see it built and installed through the fleet, which will make the bastards filthy rich. Not to mention that until the end of the war those folks wouldn't have any problems with getting their new prototypes tested. Now it was time to put it to the test. My one regret was that each of my 3 assault ships had only 1,000 missiles. When the vultures entered range, it seemed that the front of the acclimators disintegrated. Their forward third disappeared behind the violet glare of hundreds of engines. The Guardian prototypes could guide 200 missiles each at separate targets. Even better, they could burn through the ECM carried by the droid fighters at relatively long range. However, the missiles we had at this time were not designed for the role. They were relatively dumb. Even with a combination of the ship's massive targeting systems and the Guardian designed for defeating fighter ECM as well as tracking such an agile targets, the success rate was average. However, not everything was going our way. In a standard engagement, the Guardian would have much longer time to track the targets and shoot them down. That was a big problem because the current iteration of the system had trouble tracking close targets. It simply wasn't designed for that, with the enemy coming in under constant acceleration. By the time the vultures were too close to make the missile strikes no longer effective, each acclimator had fired half their magazines at the coming swarm. Most of those missiles actually hit their targets, creating the illusion of a firewall heading our way. Over 1,000 vultures were claimed by the Guardian system, making it a favorite of mine. If I had anything to say about it, which I did, there would be a lot of money thrown into producing and improving it. That was not the end of the vultures' troubles. It was time for them to run through the escort's gauntlet. First to open fire were the Karaks, followed by the Arquitans and CR-90s. The cold night of space was light up by green and blue laser show and the acclimators promptly added their own gunfire to the spectacle. Fighters died by the scores, yet the machines came at us regardless. Some of the droids calculated that it would be prudent to reduce the amount of incoming fire and redirected their flight path at the escorts. A Karak staggered under 2 kamikaze impact, the combination of detonating fuel cells and sheer kinetic impact taking their due. It fell out of formation with its gun silenced but mostly intact thanks to its highly compartmentalized interior. One of her sister ships was not so lucky. She was shattered when a whole squadron hit her in the space of 3 seconds. Even her over-engineered structure couldn't survive such abuse. The light cruiser disappeared in a bright explosion. There were no survivors, and she wouldn't be the last to fall this day. An Arquitans followed into oblivion, then another. Corvettes were left as drifting hulk after a hit or two, and the day's bloodletting was far from over. "Here they come. Choose your targets and may the force be with you," I said. Few seconds later, they were in range. My interceptor leapt forward, carried by its powerful engines, and I opened fire with the missiles with which I had it modified. 18 fire-and-forget weapons leapt from their box launchers, which I hastily ejected once they were empty, in order to reduce the weight. They had for company the missiles sent by the 417 fighters riding on my heels. "Jump now!" I ordered the remains of my reserve, moments before my Delta 7 was engulfed by the whirlwind of close-range combat. As the fighters under my direct command met the tattered remains of the enemy vulture swarm, the remaining light cruisers and corvettes jumped behind, straight between the enemy and the capital ships. My laser cannon sliced into one of the leading vultures. I spun my interceptor between the fire sent my way by 2 of his friends, which I blew away with precise bursts. All around me, the void was filled with exploding fighters. I destroyed another target and winced when my brand new astromech droid lost its head to a close miss. I blasted the damn machine which came close to shooting me down, and then there were no more targets in my sight. I made a sharp turn, guiding my interceptor towards the fleet. I could see on my scanners that the acclimators had turned to the side, and shooting more missiles at the tails of the vultures. Few might even catch them before they hit the core of my fleet. The droid fighters blew through my second line of escorts, taking some of them out. Over 700 remained to strike the umbrella of close-in defense weapons of my capital ships. We were hot on their tails, but there was no way to catch up in time. All I could do was to watch as the drama unfolded. Few hundred more vultures were brushed out of the void. 100 or so were damaged by close misses, so they didn't succeed in ramming my ships. All that was not enough. Just as I knew it won't be. When all was said and done, it would be estimated that just over 300 droid fighters made it through everything we were able to throw at them. They struck my ships with tremendous force, leaving only carnage behind. And while all that was happening, the 2 still intact CIS battleships never stopped shooting at us. First to suffer were the dreadnoughts, which were forming the front line. One was destroyed thanks to a series of lucky hits at a few weak points, causing chain reaction. Its reactor failed to scram and took the ship with it. Another 3 were left as drifting wrecks, which had their weapons and sensors stripped from their battered hulls. By the grace of the Force, the last one somehow remained unscratched. Then it was the turn of the Vinotters. All of them were hit with the exception of the 2 drifting out of control. Their heavier armor fared much better. Only Andron was destroyed after taking 60 nearly simultaneous hits at the area over its reactor. Something went wrong, because the tough armor over that area should have been able to handle such an abuse. The cruiser simply blew up spectacularly. What caused it to go up in such a way would remain a mystery. She was lost with all hands. That didn't mean that the rest remained unscratched. Armor buckled and was shattered, weapons were torn from their moorings or outright destroyed. Various systems were wrecked from the repeating hammer blows, and thousands were dead or injured on board. Redeemer was left as a drifting hulk, and on the Resolute, Admiral Yularan and his staff survived only because he found it prudent to evacuate both command towers before the enemy struck. Those structures were flaming wrecks, which had damaged control teams trying to cut them off the rest of the ship. The Requiem as well as the Conviction and Coruscant Pride were left largely untouched, because the Vulture's programming deemed them a lesser threat once the loss of their bridge towers was noted by the machines. The Executrix was not that lucky. At the start of the onslaught, her heavy anti-fighter defenses laughed at the incoming Vultures. That was until a lucky one managed to smash into one of the 2 massive shield domes. That was noticed by the remaining droids assaulting her. Then that behemoth was struck by 440 kamikazes, which fell on her like rain. Even then her tough armor shrugged hits which tried to brutalize her upper superstructure beyond recognition. It appeared the executrix and her class would become the face of the Republic's might. Then everything went to hell. Her shield domes blew up in titanic explosions and the waves of vulture droids started finding multiple weak points the hard way. When the storm of steel and fire was over, the Star Destroyer was left as a little more than a drifting wreck. The huge tower here her bridge and shield generators used to be located were shredded beyond belief. The droid fighters which survived delivering that hammer blow were viciously hunted down and annihilated with extreme prejudice. I headed back to the Requiem after ordering SAR teams to be deployed. I still had work to do. There were 2 battleships and another 2,000 or so enemy fighters as well as those 6 big-ass transports to deal with before the liberation of Ryloth could begin.